Hi everyone, so this video is aimed primarily at larger companies or where you might have more advanced or more specific carbon footprint or disclosure requirements. So there are broadly two different types of compliance requirements. They're mandatory disclosures and voluntary disclosures. So mandatory disclosures are normally linked to pieces of legislation. You have to do this under government law, for example. Therefore, they tend to impact only the bigger firms in the UK. So the key things you may have heard of are SECR, ESOS, and CSRD, and we'll define those more fully in a moment. But voluntary disclosures are largely up to you, so they can apply to any business. So a good example might be wanting to disclose data in your B Corp impact report. It could be a request for some data from a client about your impacts. Or it could be a client requesting that you disclosed a thing called the CDP, the Carbon Disclosure Project, or many other things. So let's start by looking in a bit more detail at mandatory disclosure. As I said, we're going to focus here on SECR, ESOS, and CSRD. So SECR is the Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting Requirement. And this is a piece of UK government legislation that's been around since 2019, and it applies to companies that meet at least two of the following criteria. So you have more than 250 staff, you have more than £38 million in turnover, and you have more than 18 million on your balance sheet, so two of those. If two or more of these apply to your organisation, then you'll need to include an SECR statement in your annual director's report that you send to Companies House. That will need to include your Scope 1, your Scope 2 emissions. It'll need to include your energy consumption in kilowatt hours, and it will need to include an intensity metric, so perhaps the tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per FTE. And you'll also need to explain how you've calculated that footprint, any data issues, as well as the actions you've taken to become more energy efficient and what you plan to do next year to be more energy efficient. The next one we're going to talk briefly about is ESOS, so that's the Energy Savings Opportunity Scheme. This one's a bit different, only runs every 4 years, and we're just in the final stages of the third iteration, ESOS 3, at the time of doing this, which is February 2025. ESOS is very much aimed at bigger companies. In addition to reporting your energy consumption, you have to appoint an external assessor, someone who's qualified to come and check your work, check your data. They'll also want to come and conduct some site audits, and then they'll sign off the submission that you produce. So that's a much more involved affair. Last one we're going to talk about is CSRD. So this is a piece of European legislation, primarily impacting companies that are based in Europe, but it can apply to companies that are UK based but have a significant presence in Europe, and again comes down to different thresholds of revenue and company size and too many other things to go into in a simple video like this. But there is plenty of advice out there. You can go onto the ESOS website and find more information as you need to. The crucial thing is in all three cases, it'll be expected that your data is of a high standard. So you should be using primary data as much as possible. And if you are using assumptions, you'll need to state that. You need to make sure that footprint is compliant with the GHG protocol or other approved standards, depending on where you are. So if this could apply to you, really urge you to do some research, perhaps talk to us or somebody else and get the advice you need. Of course, a knock-on effect of these mandatory disclosures for large companies is they will often be asking smaller companies in their supply chain to give them information they need. So don't be surprised if you start to hear those terms in requests that you get. So we've talked a little about examples of voluntary disclosures. For example, B Corp, external accreditations, supply chain process like CDP and EcoVadis. Each of them will tend to have individual requirements, but typically it will be that the footprint has been prepared at least in accordance with the greenhouse gas protocol and your data is of a good quality. But again, there's probably a little bit more scope for flexibility if you've struggled to get really good data. But the key with all of this is what's called comply or explain. So either give really good compliant data or explain that this is the best data you've got and this is why, but you've got a plan to make that data better in the future. So again, this comes back to what we said previously around wanting to know how that footprint data is going to be used so you can properly plan what level of data you need to collect and how accurate it's going to be.